Yeah, I think the other part of that, it's like, oh, that's kind of the point of the youth commission is you all actually don't have a direct say in a lot of the things that impact you. This is an opportunity to, even if you don't have a direct vote, to elevate your voice in some capacity and practice, some of the understanding of representative government and the structures.
Yeah, and
Sandy.
I also think, Winston, is that another argument really is that I think that the average age of a voter now is like 46 years old. And then what we learned from data shows that the earlier you vote, voting is sort of a habit. The earlier you vote, the more prolific of a voter that you will be. And I think that, I think it didn't pass, I actually supported it in the past, but, I heard a lot from my friends like, oh, they're too immature, they're this or that. But when we think that actually we have jurisdictions all over the United States that actually charge criminally many of our youth, 16 years and younger, sometimes even 12, as an adult. And when you think about what we require age-wise for for kids to be able to do, I just think like, really they should have a voice in this. They should have a voice in their future. And where it's not like we actually make space for youth voice about decisions that will affect them in the future. I am 63 years old. And so I know I legislate not just for 63-year-olds, but I actually legislate for the future generation of the Richmond. And so I just think that it's in general society, we don't make a space for youth. And voting is one of those places, I think, that those spaces that we can actually make space for a youth voice. And I actually think that, I think about what I was doing when I was 16, and I can't compare it to what kids are doing at 16, but now with so much information available to them, that I think that, they can actually weigh a lot of and gather information much more quickly than we were able to at our age about what is going on in the world, and yeah, I'm a supporter of Vote 16. I think I have always been. I just think that when we hear about youth voice, people say, well, then youth will vote. And, I don't know if I can trust their vote. Well, quite frankly, I think during these last elections for the last election 4 years ago, I really can't trust the vote of adults. And so they won't have the only voice, but they will have a voice. And then there'll be adults also who have voices, right? And so I think it's a good mixture, quite frankly.
Well, that's a great subject to introduce our subject matter today. We're going to be talking about what a supervisor does. And I'm probably going to do my best to get through as much material as I can. I'll concede from the beginning, or from right now, I have not gotten as much put in the slide deck as I would like to. So you're going to see some of my slide deck, and then I'm going to share my screen of my notes, and I'm going to go through that. I would much rather give you a very visually engaging deck, but I just haven't allocated the time for that. But I do pinky promise that I will make that in the future, and it will be shared, and I'll even read it aloud live.
Sure. And feel free to cut me off too, Winston. I just went before a choral group, and they had to kind of cut me off, and I think they were a little embarrassed to tell me to shut up. But actually, I'm kind of used to it, and I do talk a lot. So feel free, because of time constraints or interest, just feel free to just say, okay, let's move on, and I'll get the cue to just zip it up. Yeah.
Sweet. So what our format is roughly going to be today, what I'm thinking of is I'm going to give a rough presentation. We'll talk about the goals of our presentation, the duties and some of the history of the Board of Supervisors and its structure, and then some other aspects of city governance that play a role in how a supervisor serves. And I'll take some breaks in between to let Peter and Sandy weigh in and for others to ask questions. And then we'll have time at the end for more questions and general discussion as well. And afterwards, when I've got more of this tidied and organized, I will send out a list of resources so that you know where you can find this information in the future. That's my plan. Anyone have any other suggestions before I get started? All right. let me pull up. I'm going to share my screen here. Let's see if I can, how well I can do this. All right, let me see if this is going to let me do presenter view. Can I do view present? All right, so welcome everybody. I'm Winston Parsons, Community Engagement Specialist at the Richmond Senior Center. I'm going to be here today presenting about what a supervisor does in the city and county of San Francisco, and that's a distinction we'll share as well. And I'm joined today by two guests, Supervisor Sandra Fewer and Peter Lauterborn, and I'll have them introduce themselves in just a moment. First, I'm going to talk a little bit about me. Why am I here, the one talking to you? First, this is a picture, a portrait of my family. That's my grandmother, my sister and my mom. I was mostly raised by my mom and my grandmother here in San Francisco. My sister and I have the privilege of being fourth generation San Franciscans. And as you can tell, I was raised by a personality in my grandmother who, from a very young age, was constantly talking about politics. We were watching news. I was being pulled up into City Hall, and sometimes we'd go to planning commission meetings. So I was exposed from a fairly young age to local government. I went to SF State and majored in communications, minored in urban planning. I am almost graduated from USF's master's program in urban and public affairs. I've been appointed to a Citizens Advisory Committee for the Geary Bus Rapid Transit Project a number of years ago by the supervisor that Peter used to work for, Eric Mar. And I've served on the Bike Advisory Committee and a number of other roles. And as Sandy and her staff, Angelina, will probably tell you, I'm no stranger to just dropping in on their office and other offices in City Hall when I have a question related to the Senior Center or otherwise. And the other last relevant thing, I interned actually at a city agency called LAFCO, or it's technically a county agency, local agency for Formation Commission, which even I had never heard of before, but it was actually really integral in creating San Francisco's Clean Power SF program. And actually Sandy serves as the chair of LAFCO. So that's enough about me. I'm gonna let Sandy talk a little bit about herself and her role and experience.
Sure. Thank you for inviting me today. So I think most of you know I'm Sandra Fewer, and I am the supervisor of District 1. I have lived in this district since 1959. I moved to 16th Avenue when I was 2 years old. I am 63 years old. I've been married for almost 40 years, and my husband was also raised in the Richmond District. He is 65. He is a retired police officer, and his father actually was born in the front room of his house in 1911. So we have a long history here in the Richmond District. I think I know it fairly well. It raised not only me and my siblings, but it also raised my 3 children, and of course my husband and his 5 other siblings. And so the Richmond District is definitely home to us, and I am so glad that it's home to you too. I think the job of a supervisor is, it's really an honor to serve. And so for everyone on this Zoom call, I just wanted to say thank you for the opportunity to actually serve you in the capacity as your supervisor. As you know, San Francisco is divided into 11 different districts. Our district is district number 1, and everyone chooses in their district their own representative. Our district has about 80,000 residents. 65% of our residents are renters. We have a fairly diverse community out here, and we have a large Russian-speaking population and a large Chinese-speaking population, but our largest growing population here in the Richmond is our senior population. It seems to be a wonderful place, the Richmond, to not only raise kids, but also to retire in. And I have to agree, as my husband's been retired, and I am soon to enter retirement on January 8th, 2021. So the job of a supervisor, I have to say, when I first started as supervisor, I kind of really didn't know what I was doing. And I just want to be completely honest. I didn't really know how many times the supervisors met as a board, there are 11 of us, to do actually the business of the board. So although I have a lot of jurisdiction and authority over our own district, I am only 1/11 of the jurisdiction that the Board of Supervisors has over San Francisco. There were, of course, different branches of our government. We all learned that in elementary school. The executive branch is our mayor. And in San Francisco, 90% of the city budget and departments are really run by the mayor. We are a very heavy mayor authority city and county. The mayor has a lot of power. We are the legislative branch. And when it works well, there's checks and balances. And that's why the legislative branch actually exists, to actually have a checks and balances on the executive branch. It doesn't always work that way. And a lot of times there are a lot of discussions, and a lot of times there are a lot of disagreements and a lot of fights. But hopefully together we move government forward to serve the people of San Francisco. San Francisco currently has about 860,000 people. We were very stable for a long time at about 750,000, but I think you have seen, and I have seen in San Francisco and in the Richmond, that our population in San Francisco has grown. We will be over 1,000,000 people, they think, in a couple of years. And so, as you know, we've had many discussions about building, how we should build, where we should build, and for whom we should build. And so these are the types of discussions that we have at the Board of Supervisors. I have 3 legislative aides, Ian, Chelsea, and Angelina. And then I have 1 administrative assistant, who is Jackie. And the 4 of us make up the office of the District 1 Supervisor at City Hall. Everyone has their own office and they have their own staff. So we work closely with our colleagues on decisions. We don't always agree, but it is our job to come to compromise, because city government must move forward. I think that one of the most biggest challenges of being a supervisor is balancing also not only my responsibility as a supervisor, but trying to understand the concerns of my constituents and really advocate for our district. I think that everyone wants to advocate for the constituents in their area, but in the Richmond district, I think that what we have seen is that we don't have some of the really deep problems or challenges that some other districts have. And I'm going to give you an example. Yes, we have seen an increase in homelessness. But if you go out throughout San Francisco and you will go to certain parts of San Francisco, you will see that we have maybe 10 tents. When you go out to further down into the core of the city, there are districts that have 300 tents. When you go out to other places, you will see tons of people, not even with tents, but just homelessness. And this is the job of the mayor. And I know a lot of people put it on me. It is my job to advocate to city departments to assist us with our homeless problem. It is the mayor's job to actually direct department heads toward a solution or plan for our homeless population. And so while I know many people get upset about homelessness, I think it is important to know that supervisors really have very limited power over homelessness. It is really on the hands of on the shoulders of the mayor, because the mayor is the one who directs 90% of city resources to her vision or her plan. I think we also have very close contact. As you know, when people call my office and they say, oh, there's a bunch of garbage out here, or I've got a ton of potholes here, it is my job to meet with city department heads and say, what can you do to fill my potholes, the potholes in my district? This intersection needs a new stop sign or a new light. We do traffic calming. We meet with MTA about muni access, especially for my most vulnerable and transit dependent residents. And then we meet with small business. And then every year, every supervisor sits on a committee, and you're appointed to that committee by the president of the Board of Supervisors. And President Yee has appointed me chair of the budget committee. Many people think it is a very powerful committee to be on, because you determine where the city budget goes. I think it is a very challenging position. And even this year, even more challenging, considering we're facing unprecedented challenges, such as a $1.7 billion deficit. It's also important to know that every supervisor for the last couple of years has been given, is allocated a certain pot of money to be put toward services just in their district. I tend to fund heavily senior services and youth services. I think that we also vote on things like what should be on the ballot. So this year you will see that there are ballot measures that's been sponsored by both the supervisors and the mayor. There are some that are just by the mayor, and there are some just by the supervisors. But these things come on the ballot after a vote of the Board of Supervisors. Yes, and I see a picture of Peter Lauterborn there. So Peter not only is the same age as one of my daughters and their friends, but he was the aide for Supervisor Eric Mar. Do you think at this time it'd be helpful for Peter to give his view of the legislation? Oh, and I just want to, why was Peter's position called a legislative aide? Because his job is to help create legislation. We also, at the Board of Supervisors, we pass laws and ordinances. And especially during this COVID time, you might have seen that we passed many ordinances to protect renters and also to protect small businesses and assist them. And so we as supervisors depend heavily on our legislative aides to do the research and guide the legislation through the legislative process of going through committees and meeting with other board members and meeting with the city attorney to make sure that the legislation we create is not only thoughtful, but it is also, and it also has the, serves the intention actually of what the legislation was trying to do. Many times it's a compromise, sometimes it is not, but it is a job of a legislative aide actually to help tweak sometimes that legislation we are proposing so that we can get consensus on the board and actually pass it. The mayor can always veto anything if there's only 6 votes. It only takes 6 votes to actually pass legislation. If you have 8 votes, it is veto proof. And so this is always our goal, to make it unanimous or at least 8 votes. With that, I will give it back to Winston and he can introduce, I think, Peter Lauterborn. Thank you.
Thanks, Sandy. Yeah, Peter, can you briefly talk about who you are and what your background is, and then I can get into the meat and history of what the supervisor's role and structure of our local government is. Oh, and you're going to have to unmute there, bud.
Thanks. Sorry, I lost my controls there. Yeah, I also am lucky enough to have been born and raised in the city, grew up in the Mission District, did go to middle school at Presidio with one of Sandy's daughters. And I started out working a lot with young people in government to help them realize their policy goals and interests. So I worked at the San Francisco Youth Commission, the School District Student Advisory Council, and the Department of Children, Youth, and their Families in various roles to that end. So I worked a lot on, they were interested in police reform. They were interested in making immunity-free for youth, local hiring practices, subsidies for education. And so I got kind of immersed in policy through there. And then I really had the privilege of working for Supervisor Eric Mar shortly after I moved into the Richmond District neighborhood in 2011. I joined his team the next year and spent the next 3 years serving the district there. I know Winston has more to share on the presentation, but I'll just add one other thing to the role of an aide, which is sometimes, for all the right reasons, typically, elected officials can get into fights with each other. And it's the job of the aides to still keep working, even when those situations at the top, again, for often very legitimate reasons, can hit the ice and can get really difficult. And so how do we keep working at that staffing level to share information, keep committees on schedule, get the legislation up there, maybe hash out something that we can bring back to our respective bosses to make things work. And so it's an exciting job. And then the last piece is also just how we help constituents with things, understanding what the executive branch is doing and to advocate on their behalf. So we'll probably talk more about that element later. And Winston, I'll kick it back to you.
Cool. Thank you both. Yeah, I'm really glad that both Supervisor Fewer and Peter could join us today, because they'll bring very different perspectives, but complementary ones on what the office itself does. And you started hearing Peter talking a little bit about that. And I'm gonna move to our next slide now, if I can get this thing to work. So I have a few quick goals. One, I'm hoping to present this material to you in as impartial manner as possible, recognizing that that's not ever fully possible. Hoping that you can learn the power and formal and informal duties and powers of a supervisor, better understand how the city and county itself functions, become a more informed voter in general, and to empower our community members at the Richmond Senior Center and beyond with knowledge and tools so that you, the stakeholders and residents in the city and county of San Francisco, can make the government more responsive to you and your needs. With that in mind, we're going to talk a little bit first about what Sandy started talking about, which is that most of the actual function of San Francisco's governance is carried out by the mayor, who oversees most of our city services. Let me see if I can get to our next picture. The Board of Supervisors is our legislative branch. This is all of them up there. There's one for 11 districts. And then I believe we've got the clerk of the board to the left. And the clerk, they run the office that serves all the committees and material and makes all the public notices that the supervisors have to put out. This, if you can see it decently, I don't know if it will work. Yeah, that is our organization chart broadly for the city. And the resolution of this picture is not very good, and I apologize. But you can see a direct line connecting from the mayor to the Academy of Sciences, the Airport Commission, the Arts Commission, Fine Arts Museums, Human Rights Commission, the Medical Examiner, and a whole slew of other offices and services. To the left, pictured underneath the mayor, but separate from the mayor, are a number of other offices that are elected. We have an assessor recorder who records what the property tax values and related issue items are. We have the Board of Supervisors, which is a separate branch, the city attorney, district attorney, those are elected, public defender, sheriff, and the Superior Court. As Sandy mentioned, we have sort of a similar setup to even our federal government, where we have a separation of judicial, legislative, and executive branch. And what's important, I'll share this out in a higher resolution later, you'll note at the bottom of this chart, there is a little guide. It says A for appointed, E elected, and S shared appointment by various. And what that means is A, if there's an A next to an office or somebody's name, that means typically the mayor appoints whomever's in charge of that. E equals an elected official. And S means shared appointment by various elected officials. So for a few departments or agencies or commissions, the leadership is a few people picked by the mayor and a few people picked by the supervisor. So for example, if my memory serves me, and Peter and Sandy, correct me if I'm wrong, but the SFMTA is solely appointed by the mayor, but confirmed by the Board of Supervisors. So the supervisors can accept or reject an appointment to that commission. Whereas the Planning Commission, I believe, has a few supervisors appointments. Am I correct there, Sandy?
Yes, absolutely.
There you go. So, but on the whole, most of the appointments for city services, the buck stops with the mayor. So let's see if I can go. What do I have in next slide? Oh, we're going to come back to trivia break in a little bit. What I am going to do is I'm going to share a different slide. Just a moment here. If I can stop the sharing, and I'm going to go to share different document. If I can get it to work for me. Yes. Hang on here. And actually, while I'm paused here, Karen, Kana, or Cheryl, do you have any questions or comments on what we've talked about thus far? Or should I keep chugging along?
Not at this time, thank you.
Okay.
Go ahead, Winston.
Thanks, Kana. All right, so you're going to get to look at my a little bit messy and disjointed note documents. So I talked about myself, about Sandy. All right. So we have the actual structure chart here of the Board of Supervisors. So much like any organization or entity, the Board of Supervisors itself actually is an organization. It has, as Sandy mentioned, legislative aides. There are 3 legislative aides, 1 administrative aide, and it's worth noting that the administrative aide is new. I believe it's just within the past year or so that there actually has been an administrative aide. So for years, legislators in San Francisco have had only 3 staff. And we could debate whether it's only or if that's too many or not enough. There's lots of kerfuffle about that, but 3 staff. And there's a whole team of people that support that. There's the budget and legislative analyst whose their job is to report to the supervisors. We're going to do research and we're going to see what we think the budgetary impacts of your choices might be, and what the research says from maybe what other cities and communities have done and what have the impacts been. Let's say the supervisors want to, increase a tax or change a law. Some of their job is to do the homework on that and say, well, what might be the impacts of that, good or bad? And there are a whole litany of other people that even support SFGov TV. Everything that's happening at City Hall in terms of commissions, Board of Supervisors or otherwise is recorded and publicly available and even broadcast on local television. So we went through the org chart locally. The next thing to talk about would probably be the city charter. So there are 2 types of cities in California. And the important thing to note is that cities are viewed legally as a subdivision or offshoot of the state. And there are general law cities, which borrow most of their laws and structure from the state of California, or charter law cities. And that basically is a city decides, you know what, we're a big enough deal that we're going to create our own mini constitution for our governance and structure. And that's what San Francisco has. We're a charter city. We were first chartered as a city in 1850. And since then, the structure of our city has changed a bunch. For example, as Sandy mentioned earlier, we now have 11 supervisors and they're picked by district. So you vote on your neighborhood. But in the past, and it switched back and forth a number of times, there used to be citywide elections. So you would vote on all the representatives for the city and county of San Francisco. And it's worth noting, I believe, that one of the first times we had district elections in the 70s, part of the move towards that was to try and let underrepresented groups have a greater shot at representation. And the first time that happened, actually, Supervisor Harvey Milk won his office. And I think the first Chinese American supervisor won office as well. And it's gone back and forth a few times since then, but today we have district elections. So San Francisco's charter is our rule book, our constitution. Supervisors themselves, I'm going to go through the general structure here. It's a full-time job in San Francisco, and it's worth noting that in some communities, it's not. We have roughly a $12 billion budget in San Francisco, and the state of California is the 5th largest economy on the planet. So there's a lot to be managed. In some other communities in the US and even in California, a supervisor or even city councilor is a part-time job. And I would also note, and I'm backtracking back here, San Francisco, we are a city and county. Other community, we're the only one in the state of California to be both a city and county. And that means typically a county, you have a school district, you have sheriff, and a number of other responsibilities that are not covered by cities. San Francisco, we're all combined. So especially if someone comes up, looks at the budget and like, oh my God, why is it so big? Well, we are doing the same functions that Alameda County is doing, plus what Oakland as a city would be doing. Supervisors, for their pay and compensation themselves, it's reviewed every 5 years by the Civil Service Commission, which is a committee appointed with 5 people appointed by the mayor. And it was established in the year 1900 for San Francisco, largely in response to government corruption, both in San Francisco and in the US. There was a movement at the time to say a lot of people are just getting appointed and making deals in City Hall for their buddies. We need a merit-based system for our government representatives. So 5 commission per body with 6 staff, and they're not paid, but they decide every so often, every 5 years, what the pay for the Board of Supervisors is. Supervisors are paid roughly $140K a year. That was recently increased. The commission itself said, well, we feel this is artificially low in the past, given the fact that these folks are managing a $12 billion budget, and they want to incentivize professional representatives. It's also worth noting with that, despite the fact that $140K might seem like a lot of money, the mayor is paid a fair amount more, roughly $300K a year. And despite that, supervisors are still not in the top 25 paid positions in city government. That typically goes to the deputy sheriffs, many of whom earn $300,000 and $400,000. And I think the highest paid employee is the retirement system investment officer, who earns over $500,000 a year. And I'm actually going to pitch a question to Peter on this, because I remember asking Peter this question some years ago, and I felt he had a very useful response. Why do supervisors get paid so much? Why do we? What is the benefit or thinking behind that?
It means not only rich people can run. That previously, before district elections, or actually maybe right after. I'm sorry, my baby's trying to take a nap, so he's a little upset right now. It used to be that legislative aides actually got paid more than the supervisors. The supervisors were paid, I think, $25,000 or $30,000. And you only had people with land, with money, with their own businesses who had outside income, which some of that experience is probably welcome on the board, but it also is a pretty narrow perspective compared to other average San Franciscans. And so by increasing the pay, they were able to attract candidates who are comfortable saying, well, this might be my only income. I'm going to focus on the job full time, and I'm not going to go broke doing so. Yeah, we want professionals.
Thanks, Peter. Yeah, I knew I was going to call on Peter for that for a good reason. All right. So then the question becomes, what are we electing these people for? What are they doing? What's the meat of their duty? And Supervisor Feuer was starting to get to this earlier. There are 2 main things that supervisors pass in terms of resolutions. And I'll let Sandy and Peter explain this a bit further in a moment, but there are 2 main things. One of them is called an ordinance. The other is called a resolution. An ordinance is a legislative act. It is an act of law. And with the way it's structured, supervisors or the Board of Supervisors can only write an ordinance on one subject at a time. So you can't pack a bunch of different things into one law. It has to be read twice, 5 days apart at the full board meeting with all the 11 people there. And you have to wait at least 30 days before it takes effect, unless it's authorizing the city to take on some more debt. And there's a bunch of other details there, but that's the basics of the ordinances. Then there are resolutions, and those are more statement of positions or opinions. So San Francisco, the Board of Supervisors could pass a resolution saying, it's the official statement of San Francisco that dogs are better than cats. That's a very simple argument, but there are a whole bunch of other things, and that's probably, I suspect, what is most frequently passed at the board, just because it's often easier to do so. So you only require one reading for an ordinance. It can be adopted and the first moment you introduce it, more or less. And other ordinances, you often have to start at a committee, which is a smaller group of the board, and then it has to go to the full board. And then last but not least, there are emergency ordinances for emergencies affecting public life, health, property, or to ensure the uninterrupted operation of city services that are required by law. Those can suspend aspects of the city charter, which is like the city's rule book or constitution. But even in an emergency ordinance, they can't suddenly decide to levy new taxes, change salaries, utility rates, or buy, sell, or lease properties. I'm going to pause real quick. I'm going to ask Sandy and Peter if there's anything about ordinances or resolutions I'm missing here.
Yes, I will say that most of the time, resolutions, yes, a statement, an opinion or position, and they're not binding. Whereas an ordinance is binding, it's law, and so you must do it. So a lot of times we will write resolutions in support of or in opposition of, and they're not binding, but it is a political statement of where the board stands. And I think that we hear a lot, resolutions are most often put on because outside groups come and they're very interested in a particular item or an issue. And then they'll ask the supervisors, can you write a resolution? And so I think that you will see a lot of resolutions, and Winston is absolutely correct. It is easier to pass a resolution, quite frankly. But at any time that a supervisor may send it to committee. So even though it's not required to go to committee, when it comes before the board, any supervisor who wants more discussion on it can actually require that it goes, ask that it goes to a committee, and that is not up for the vote of the board. If one board member says, I want that resolution to go to committee, it goes to committee, which delays the process for either approval or rejection of that resolution.
Great, thanks, Sandy. Peter, anything else to add?
I think the only thing I would add is that, Winston mentioned earlier that a lot of cities just basically follow the state law. And California in particular has a very intrusive set of state legislation that dictates what a city can do, even a chartered city like San Francisco. So often the things that the city is saying, we support we support this, we oppose this, it can often be about legislation that would require state approval because we just can't do, for example, Uber and Lyft, that's an issue that San Francisco does not have control over. We're not allowed to legislate about that here. So you might write a non-binding resolution saying, gee, we'd really like if the state government would let us do this, or, if we could, this is what we would do. So that's the other purpose of the non-binding resolution. It's not just for fun.
Oh, yeah. Thanks. I will add to that, and I think I touch on this a little bit later, but there are other things too. I frequently hear people say like, well, why doesn't the Board of Supervisors or the mayor do this? Like, why don't we levy a local income tax when we're really hurting for cash? State law actually prohibits us locally from doing that. Why don't we build more social or public housing? Well, actually, state law requires that we go to local voters to get their approval before doing that, which you'll see on this ballot this year. So that's an excellent point that Peter makes as well. As Sandy noted earlier, the Board of Supervisors can actually overrule a veto by the mayor, but that's if they have a supermajority or 8 votes. Let's see. Meetings themselves, any special meeting requires 24-hour notice. If they're meeting outside of City Hall, they have to give 15 days notice. But the first meeting for the Board of Supervisors every year, the first meeting in odd numbered years is at 12 o'clock, January 8th. Afterwards, the board can decide, but it's typically Tuesdays. And they're required to have a quorum, which means you have to have a majority of people there to actually show up and do business. Let me add here some other important notes. Supervisors have a term of 4 years. They can serve 2 successive terms in a row maximum. They have to wait, if they want to do it again, they can, but they have to wait another 4 years. So I think an example of that would be Supervisor Aaron Peskin, who served 2 terms in the past, waited several terms, and then ran for office again. An important note, if a supervisor resigns with less than 2 years remaining, that effectively counts as them having served a full 4-year term. And if someone does resign or passes away in office, the mayor can appoint the supervisor to fill the rest of the term. And so we've seen actually a lot of supervisors that have gotten onto the board and been elected even later have been mayoral appointees. We talked about staff and legislative aides. Oh, something also important I forgot. Most supervisors' office, and say all, have interns, which actually play often a really important role in sort of supporting the day-to-day management and office administration and even preparation work that a supervisor does, especially if they're going out to the community and giving presentations or doing constituent work. So I think interns should get a lot of recognition. So sometimes if you're calling a supervisor's office and you want something to happen, or you're angry about something, my one special request is that you consider that the person you might be talking to might be an intern. So please be nice to start, because whatever it is, it's probably not their fault. Let's see. We talked about city and county. The other important thing to note in local government, especially in the Bay Area, there are special districts that supervisors really don't have direct say over. So BART, for example, is a special district. It's got its own special map and people that you vote for. A lot of other communities have mosquito or fire abatement districts. So that's another group of people that you vote for, or sewer or water districts. Something that is also special and somewhat unique, or more unique to San Francisco, and in part because we are a city and county, is that we have the airport, SFO, the Public Utilities Commission, SFMTA, and the port. And I note those because they are called enterprise businesses and functions, which means they often generate revenue, make money for the city. And we'll talk about this a bit more, but the budget, people will see $12 billion and think, well, that's a lot of money. Can't you just move the money from munis, fairs over to here? And a lot of those enterprise functions, the airport, the port, MTA, the money that they generate has to be spent within their department. So you can't necessarily take muni fairs and go spend them on filling or building housing per se. Let's see, some other important notes. Bear with me because I've got some, my notes are not the tidiest here, but Peter, and I think Sandy mentioned this too, there are actually a lot of limits on what we can do as a city. So for example, we cannot run a deficit. Every year the city passes a budget, we can't spend more than we bring in. And we have reserves of money that we can spend down in potentially an emergency or have as a backstop. But unlike, say, the federal government, which can take on a fair amount of debt and can print cash, we cannot do that. Other quick notes, I talked about enterprise funds, but we have a pot of money called the general fund, and that's probably, it's often referred to as discretionary. And as my grandmother, who you saw in the picture earlier with the machete, she used to be a certified public accountant and would sit me down at a young age and be like, you're gonna learn how to calculate depreciation and do the taxes with me, Winston. She would describe discretionary or general funds as that's the money you can actually play with, quote unquote.
So can I add something to this?
Please.
The fact that these are enterprise agencies is a choice, and it's a designation. And so, it makes sense that the airport pulls in tons of money for rent revenue that it can spend on building all sorts of amenities. Where that can be challenging, for example, something like the SFMTA that runs Muni. Well, it's an enterprise agency, which means it's supposed to be largely financially self-sufficient. But yet we also want things like free Muni for youth, or we don't want Muni fares to be too high, or we want a bus that maybe stops more often than is efficient. And so sometimes there's conflicts between the stated goals of these being quote unquote enterprise agencies to go kind of run themselves, but there's still public benefits that we want from them. And so, Sandy in her position as chair of the budget committee, is often kind of weighing a lot of these things. Even though these departments should just be kind of self-sustaining, there's still really massive value judgments that need to be made.
That's a great point. Yeah, I think that also alludes to something relevant here. One of my professors for my graduate program was Ed Harrington. And for those unfamiliar, Ed Harrington used to be the city controller. So he would manage and oversee much of the city's budget. He used to be the head of the SF Public Utilities Commission, our water, sewer, and some of our power, and head of Muni's finance. And as he used to say when he gave our urban and public finance class, a budget is a statement of your values. What you put your money towards, the money is, you're deciding what is most important, what is less important, and what aren't you going to fund at all. So what Peter is getting towards, I think, or was noting, is an important note. And one of the most important functions besides policy that a supervisor and City Hall manages is what do we spend our money on, right? Because we can have a city department or an agency or service, but you could underfund it, not fund it enough, and it won't work well or adequately. The next thing real quick, and I might pass this a bit to Sandy, is to talk about the budget process. And just noting, it's about 1:50. We'll go pretty briefly. Yeah, time's flying here. But San Francisco has, I think a lot of cities do, but a rather complicated and sometimes I would say exhausting budget process. And I think Sandy, who is the chair of the Budget and Finance Committee, maybe you could speak a little bit to that. And I've got it laid out in the graph right there. I'll zoom in a bit.
Sure. So what happens is that, every year we have to do a budget. We do a 2-year budget. And so the mayor begins to talk to all her city departments. And the mayor says to the departments, I'm going to give you budget instructions, and I want you to submit your proposed budgets to me. So the mayor has jurisdiction, as Winston said, only over the general fund money. So she doesn't, when she does her budget, it doesn't include, the airport, the port, MTA, Public Utilities Commission. It's only the general fund money. And so she does this whole process and with her departments, and then she puts in her priorities. And this is where it is so important to know that the mayor you vote for is actually aligned with things that are important to you, because she can add what she wants into the budget or not. And this mayor has a couple of pet projects that she always wants to add in. So then after she does the budget, she's through with the budget. The budget is now given over to the Board of Supervisors. It is our job at the Board of Supervisors to actually go through the budget and look for inefficiencies, to look for waste. And we get the help of the budget legislative analyst, and they will look at some of the largest departments. There's over 50 city departments. And so they look at the largest departments that have the largest budgets, and they look through them to see where we can pull out for waste. So sometimes they'll look at, for example, you've had this position, funded this position for 3 years, but you've never hired anyone. We're going to take that position back. And they put it into a pot of money called our add back money. And this money usually amounts to about $40 million a year. And that is the money that the supervisors can reallocate to things that really the Board of Supervisors wants to fund and that the mayor has not funded or the mayor has cut out of her budget. So for example, this year, the mayor cut out about $2 million of contracts that were given to Asian Pacific Islander nonprofits. And so as the budget chair, we reinstated that money after meeting with all the nonprofits that were being cut. Everyone also has to vote on this budget. So it means that we have to make a budget that is actually a compromise between all the 11 Board of Supervisors, because again, we are mandated, quite frankly, to pass a city budget every year, a balanced budget. And so this is where some of the tension comes in. As budget chair, though, I will say that I work very well with the mayor. And I always ask the mayor, what are your main priorities? And then I will push back on her. But I always respect the mayor's priorities and things that are important to her. I understand she's the mayor, so I try not to touch those things. But other things that we feel as supervisors should be reallocated, we are weighing the needs of our constituents. We are weighing the needs of the most vulnerable. So I wanted to also say Norman Yee and I have really funded a lot of senior subsidies, housing subsidies, food subsidies, a lot of programming for seniors. Supervisor Norman Yee and I are the oldest people that serve on the Board of Supervisors. And so we know that how important it is to fund these nonprofits like our Richmond District neighborhood, Richmond District Senior Center, to give the programming to seniors that they need in order to live healthy and viable lives here in San Francisco. And so I hope that helps. Winston, I just also wanted to say that I know we're running out of time, but I'm also happy to explain anything about city government that I would know and share information with you again. And I think that your format here is pretty comprehensive, quite frankly. Even though you say your notes are a little sloppy, I actually think it's pretty comprehensive.
Thank you, Sandy. Yeah, I'm going to zoom out of my notes a bit. Thank you for adding that. I really appreciate it. We touched on some of the key people, the mayor. Oh, the other person that we must note, I wish I had a picture of her already, the city manager or administrator. That's Naomi Kelly. And so city administrator oversees most of and a lot of the city's services and sort of is the actor that the mayor puts to task at delivering a lot of the stuff that you and I interact with on a day-to-day basis in terms of city government. We talked about the charter. We talked a little bit about how state law can even overrule local law. We talked about some of the structure. And Sandy started talking about this, the president of the board. So when supervisors are elected, they, on one of their first meetings, actually vote on who their president is going to be. And they pick the president, and the president presides over all the full meetings, assigns legislation to a committee, and have other powers. But if I remember correctly, the president also gets to pick the offices that people go to get in City Hall.
That's absolutely right.
Yes.
Oh, well, it really goes by seniority.
Seniority, okay. I suspect the corner office is the one probably most sought after.
Yeah, it's the one the president has right now.
Sounds about right. And maybe real quick, I think we've gotten through most of the content. I'll open up some space, but there are a bunch of different committees, and they're poorly typed out here, but there are a whole bunch of different subjects that you could break in legislation into. And those the president will assign to certain committees. And the president will also pick who serves on what committee. So if there's a certain committee that you really want to be on, you're like, I have an expertise in public transportation. Please, President Norman Yee, can I serve on the Land Use and Transportation Commission? I imagine that's how some of that conversation might go. Maybe Sandy, you can touch on the committee appointments and their business a little bit.
Sure. So most times what happens is the president will poll the board and ask individual supervisors, what committee would you like to serve on? So when I first became supervisor, Mayor London Breed was the president of the Board of Supervisors, and she sat down and asked me, what committees would you like to serve on? I personally said, you are the president of the board. I will serve actually on any committee that you would request for me to serve on. But she said, if you had to nail it, which ones would you want? I said public safety and neighborhood services and rules. And she said to me, wow, Sandra, you're the first person who's ever asked me for that. Everybody wants to be on budget. And so I served on that. For example, I served on the rules committee and the public safeties committees. And these committees meet, some of them meet once a month, some of them meet twice a month, some of them meet weekly. And so I just wanted to also say, in addition to serving on committees, we also serve on other boards. So supervisors, for example, I serve on the reentry board, and I also serve, but I actually just resigned, on the Golden Gate Bridge board. So there are people who serve on not only on city and county of San Francisco boards, but also in different committees where they want a board of supervisors to actually have a representation on that committee. They serve on the mental health board, the behavioral health board. They'll serve on a variety of different committees. So my favorite committee outside of these city committees is actually the reentry committee. And so that's a meeting that meets quarterly, and I am able to communicate to the board what happens on the reentry committee.
Cool. Great, and there are a whole bunch of other ones actually as well. Yeah. So there's the
a lot of, I can get you the list, Winston. Angelina knows them all.
Yes, I'm sure. One of my resources I'll share out, we're going to wrap up shortly, but one of my favorite resources is the city's budget book. Every year, the city puts out a proposed budget, and it's 300 pages, but the first 20 or 30 pages lists all of the committees, all of the departments, who's the head of every department, how does the city work. I've pulled a lot of this information from that, actually. The other thing that I'll note real quick before opening it up to discussion is the president of the board, in the event that someone has to resign or passes away in office, will serve as the, I believe it's acting mayor. So for example, when Mayor Moscone was assassinated, Dianne Feinstein was the president of the board. She then became acting mayor. And that happened with Ed Lee when he passed as well. So that's another thing to keep in mind in terms of the structure. The other thing, I'm going to stop sharing my screen here. My last note before I open it for questions or discussions is there's, I would say, some informal powers or duties that supervisors in their position have. If you've ever heard of President Teddy Roosevelt, one of the things he was quoted as, a term he coined, was the bully pulpit. So the president has this special power in being in such a prominent office that their opinion and voice has a lot of influence. And while it's not the same with a district supervisor in San Francisco, a supervisor's voice can go a long way in sharing public information and steering public opinion. And unless they have a sour relationship with a particular member of the media, you or I, we could try and call a press conference. Press probably wouldn't show up. Supervisor calls press conference and members of the press will likely show up. That's what I have for the moment because we're just about out of time. But I wanted to open up real quick. I can stay for a bit for any questions or discussions or anything else to be added. Karen, Kana, Angelina.
I wanted to ensure that I understood that you said it's the state who has responsibility for budgeting of affordable housing in the city. Did I understand it correctly?
Not entirely. I could have done a better job explaining it. So there is, in the late 1950s or early 60s, in the state of California passed a law amending our state constitution that said, effectively, if a city wants to build more public or affordable housing, you have to go to the voters to ask them almost every time. And so that effect was, it made it a lot harder for cities to build public housing. And this was sort of people would argue that it was a reactionary and even a racist attempt at precluding more Black and brown individuals from getting housing in urban areas and suburban areas as well. So if San Francisco, for example, wants to build a bunch of social or public housing, we have to get voter approval. So you'll see on the ballot, or you already saw, Prop K this year, which basically says, hey, San Francisco voters, can we have your permission to potentially build, I think it's like 30 some odd thousand units of public housing or social housing. So that is an example of where state law overrules local law in San Francisco, because maybe the mayor and maybe the Board of Supervisors would like to say, hey, we've got money, we would like to build a bunch of affordable or social housing. State law says not so fast. If you do it over a certain number of units, you have to ask the voters.
I think another really good example is, a lot of times we will see our small businesses and they'll say, oh, they've gone out of business, the rent went up. So we have been trying to do rent control for our retail spaces, but the state has mandated that we cannot. So that is why you will see, for example, a really good example is at 23rd in Geary, that there was a bakery and then there was a nail salon and there was also a haircutting place. That one whole building has one owner, and that one owner raised the rent 3 times the amount of rent in 1 month. So that is why you will see 3 or 4 empty storefronts right along Geary, right on 23rd and Geary, simply because they could not, these small businesses, you can only cut so many heads of hair every day in order to make the rent. And so because he raised the rent so high, all of those small businesses went out of business. And so we have been trying to put rent control on retail space, but the state says no. And how does that happen? I think that it's a lot of lobbyists. It is a lot of money from real estate industries that say, no, we are protecting all of the landlords who say, it's your prerogative. If you would like to raise the rent tenfold in 1 month, you may. Is that good for our neighborhood? Absolutely not. Is it good for small businesses? No, and it actually has destroyed so many small businesses in our district, some that have been actually in place for 30 years. But I go to them and they tell me, look, my rent's gone up 3 times. I just can't do it. And so I think that's a really good example of something that we would like to do in San Francisco. Our hands are tied because the state says you may not, and the state has passed that because the real estate industry has funded our lawmakers actually who make these laws. And that's just kind of how it works. Pay to play is a very real thing in setting our ordinances and actually controlling the way we live here in San Francisco, but all over. It's I could go into this much longer, but it is absolutely true. And that is why we always look at who is funding who, and we follow the money because as a legislator and a lawmaker myself, I know very well that pay to play is very, very real. And this is why our hands are tied on many of these issues, such as Peter mentioned around, Uber and Lyft, and because they have lobbyists and they have a lot of money and they're able to throw their money around. And these have a reality of how laws are made.
Yeah, thanks for sharing, Sandy. I think that's an important, note. We didn't quite have the time. Maybe I'll do a 2.0 when we talk about the actual process of running for office in San Francisco. But San Francisco versus many other places, we actually have some public dollars that you can qualify for, and a lot of other rules and regulations that the federal level does not have. But that's its own whole subject and can of worms. The one other last note I might add is when we're voting for a local supervisor or other elected official, the thing I would personally say keep in mind is this might be somebody who doesn't just want to serve for the moment or does serve for the moment as a supervisor or another position, but maybe someday they'll be heading for higher office. So we're not just voting for that position, but we also want to potentially be thinking about how might they act in a different role or with greater impact. Maybe someday for going from supervisor, they will be at the state level setting state laws. So that's one thing I would encourage everybody to always think about. Any other questions or comments, Kana, Angelina, Karen, before I close things? Oh yeah, the CACs, thanks. There's a bunch of advice. Angelina left a note here, and I'll include this in the resources I send out, but there are a bunch of advisory committees that people can be appointed to, like a couple that I've served on in the past. So that's another way that citizens can get more involved as well.
Hi, I got questions for Sandy. This is Kana, and Sandy, can I ask you what's the most challenging part as the Richmond supervisor?
Yeah, I think that the most challenging thing about being a supervisor is trying to really serve your district, but not having full control over the resources that can actually make a difference in your district. So I don't know, for a long time, we didn't have a water suppression system here. And I spent 2 years fighting to get $191 million in a bond to actually protect us in case we have a fire. And so I think if I was in control of the city departments and funds, I would be able to serve actually my district better. I have actually a good relationship with most city departments, but I would say that we have very little authority over what department heads do and the direction of where funds go. And so I think that is one of the most challenging things. And I think another thing too, Kana, is just the toll that it sort of takes on you as a person. It is a huge responsibility. It is the last thing you think about, you know, before you go to bed, and the first thing you think about when you wake up is just about your district and all the thousands of people that depend on you. Quite often I'll get a text in the middle of the night, there's been a fire in my neighborhood and so many people are displaced, you know. I remember getting a text at 3:30 in the morning and saying, so there's a fire and it was a couple blocks from my house, and I just, you know, hopped into sweatpants and started driving people to hotels so they'd have a place to stay, because at 3:30 in the morning, you know, I don't want them to have to take in their pajamas, take the bus to their hotel. And so I think, you know, there is great need in our district. There's a limited amount of resources. And I think that, you know, if I had more jurisdiction over some of these resources, I think that it might be distributed differently. Again, the mayor and I think that we have a good working relationship, but ideology-wise, we actually really differ. And so it is also about the relationships, Kana, and everybody working together, and it's like herding cats and everyone's got their opinion. And I get as frustrated with my friends on the board as I do with the people that actually I don't work that closely with on the board. So everybody gets kind of frustrated with each other. And it's amazing actually that we're able to come to a decision sometimes that is absolutely unanimous. And when that happens, you know that you've done a very good job of hearing every single person that is voting on that and making sure that everyone feels okay enough to put their vote to say yes on it. Thanks for the question.
That's an excellent question. I actually have to skedaddle and wrap things up. Otherwise, I'm sure we could be here all day, because this is an amazing world. And honestly, it's a really interesting, I think, lens into some of the stuff that even happens at the state and federal government. And my last note is, you know, I emphasize sort of from my understanding and experience, you know, what Sandy was talking about. There's a lot of things that even our local government, you might think that they have control over, that they don't necessarily. And I would say, you know, if you encounter something that isn't going right, or you have a concern about in your day-to-day usage, call 311. No presentation for the city would be, and I'm not the city, don't call me. If there's a pothole, it's not, I can't fix it.
Oh, you can actually text me on that. Yeah, or email me or call my office on that.
Yeah.
Poor Angelina, she's probably going to follow up with that, but yes. No. But I just also want to say, Winston, that if you'd like to continue this conversation, or is there an aspect of this conversation that everyone who is on would like to delve more deeper into it, I am happy to do that. And, you know, I wish we could do this in person, because actually I think that it's so much easier in person to do it. But I want to thank you for the opportunity. And I'm so sorry that I also must leave this call. Yeah. But I'm happy to come back, you know, and I'm actually happy to speak informally. I think most people know I'm pretty transparent. I try to be as completely honest as I can be. You know, I'm pretty much an open book. I will tell you everything honestly, I probably accept my weight, but everything else I'm pretty open about.
Thank you, Sandy.
Okay, thank you.
Take care.
Yeah,
I'm gonna
thanks for inviting me. Bye-bye.
Close the meeting up, but I'll share the resources and recording afterwards, and we might even get some of this interpreted into Cantonese. Thank you, Peter and Kana and Angelina and Karen, for coming.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.